Welcome to week 5. Sorry for the delay. YouTube has not been completely cooperative today. So this is audio 1 of week 5. I want to briefly advise you that there is an interesting lecture coming up tomorrow. That's May 1st at 7 p.m. at Smith 238. It is by the Professor Emeritus Mel Gertoff, and he's talking about his book, which is called Will This Be China's Century? A Skeptical View. So here we go. Let me do a little bit of YouTube stuff here. I will take this and I will photocopy it and I will put it up on D2L so you can see it without having to struggle. There we are. I like the balloons. So, the other thing I'd like to talk about is the readings. Now, a number of you have told me this is your first 400 series course. You can't believe how much reading is assigned. I want to reassure you that the reading is being assigned through guidance I've received from the history department at this university. People here have suggested 200 to 250 pages a week. You'll notice from my revision of the syllabus that is now up on D2L, dated I think the 20th of April, that I've actually signed a little bit less than that in the coming weeks. And I'd like to give you some tips about how to handle it. I've been there myself. I only recently completed my doctorate. I did almost all of it while I was working full-time for Intel in Asia, running all over the place doing investigations in airports of stolen computer chips and stuff like that. So that meant that I did most of my work on this dissertation at between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. in the morning. So I know what it's like to have to work and study at the same time. We have several different kinds of books, you've noticed. 2 of them go into a lot of detail about the subject, that is the book on Chiang Kai-shek by Taylor and the book on Tibetan history, recent Tibetan history by Shakya. What you should do with these, if you can't make it through everything, is summarize, look at the beginning of each chapter that's assigned, look at his summary of the main issues, and then go to the end of the chapter and look for his wrap-up, where he talks about what was important and why things happened. It's not a perfect solution by any means, but it helps if you can't make it through everything. Then we also have the Joseph book, which is shorter and is much more condensed. It's like eating a piece of chocolate fudge instead of something else. There's a lot more calories per page in Joseph. And in the ones I've assigned, particularly the reading by Tevis, that's T-E-I-W-E-S, Frederick Tevis, read that one really carefully. There are different parts assigned in different weeks. There's part of it assigned this week, part of it assigned next week, and so on. He's really condensed the issues down into the essence of what happened under Mao Zedong. And the same thing goes for the reading by Bruce Gilley that follows. So you can focus on those, and also focus on Meisner, because Meisner, the Mao's China and After book, goes into a moderate amount of detail, although I know it's a little bit difficult to read. It's a really standard textbook. So give that a try. While you're doing this stuff, make sure you take notes in one way or another. Talk to me by phone or in person. I'm in Kramer 437 most days of the week. You can text me. You've got my phone number on slide 1 of this lecture. Text me before you show up to make sure that we don't miss each other. and we can talk about study strategies if you want. Again, if you're a remote student, give me a call on my cell phone. Okay, let's take a look now at slide 2. This rough summary of events is meant to be something for you to print out and keep with your notes. I don't want to read through all this. I could spend an hour talking about just this slide and really bore you to death, but I won't do that. You can see here that I've tried to document the important events that led to changes in the way things were done and in the perceptions of the outside world. So you can keep this as a reference and use it when you need it. Going on to slide 3, skipping through slide 3 and going on to slide 4. Let's talk about confession. Confession is a very important thing, depending on your religion, depending on your ideology. This slogan, 坦白从宽，抗拒从严, it's one of my faves. This whole idea that if you confess, we'll be lenient with you. If you resist, we will come down hard on you, has been around for a long time, and it's still around. The police still say this to people when they interview them, and I've heard it, not as an interviewee, of course, but as a witness during a theft investigation in China. Here I am representing a particular company, sitting with the police, listening to them interrogate somebody, and they actually came out and said this, which caused me to stifle a chuckle. Unfortunately, nobody noticed it in the room at the time. The idea here is that if you're arrested by the police, you must have done something. There must be some reason why you're arrested by the police. So you should be confessing something. The other idea that I didn't put on the slide is that if you are truly innocent, and especially if you're a Communist Party member, you should be able to hold out under interrogation and resist until you're dead. And I'm not kidding. We've talked about that a little bit before when we spoke about how Communist Party members were told that if they were captured by the Kuomintang during the revolution, that they were expected to resist and not confess anything. The same idea, in theory, held during the more difficult parts of the revolution and afterwards, during the more violent phases, that if somebody's really innocent, they'll never, ever confess, no matter what we do to them. Of course, the reality is a little bit different. And it's not that this is a communist thing either, or even a Chinese thing. All you have to do is look at Abu Ghraib to know that Americans are capable of this sort of mentality, unfortunately. And even within our own culture, there's been a lot of argument about it. If you read, for example, the book by William Colby, the former director of the CIA, called Honorable Men, he makes a very strong argument against torture, saying it's stupid, it doesn't work, it makes people say things that aren't true just to make the pain stop. The arguments on both sides of that question are old and continue. Let's go on to slide 5. So the first purge of top leaders in the PRC happened rather early. These two men you see here, the one on top with the glasses, Gao Gang, was especially important. He was a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, or back then they didn't have a standing committee, they just had a Politburo, but anyway, he was a member of the top leadership. And no one has really come to a conclusion about why Mao Zedong did this, but it seems, in retrospect, that he was urging Gao Gang to do something, maybe as a test, or maybe he was simply being careless in his remarks to Gao Gang, although that's hard to believe because Mao was nothing if he was not a manipulative genius. But he told Gao Gang that he thought that Liu Shaoqi, then Mao's designated successor, and Zhou Enlai, the head of government, were too conservative and that he's thinking about replacing them. So Gao Gang took this as a signal to go out and politic amongst other senior leaders to do just that. And the reason this pissed Mao off is that Mao felt, it seems, this is analysis that it's not my original idea, a lot of people think this in this field, is that Mao thought that I'm the emperor, I make these decisions, I can say things like this if I want, but only one person actually takes action in these cases, and that's me because I'm the emperor. Anything else would be potentially a threat to my power. That is, if anybody did anything where I did not specifically tell them to go do it, then they are a loose cannon and they must be removed. So the significance of the replacement of Gao Gang, his suicide a few months later, is that this made it very clear to everyone that Mao's word was absolutely the law and that he could do anything he wanted, any time he wanted, if it wasn't clear to everybody by this time anyway. Again, to review very briefly, Mao became the senior military leader of the party after the Zunyi conference during the early part of the Long March in 1934, and into 35, he became the senior military leader, but he was not at that point the unchallenged leader of the party at all. There were other people who were in charge of things, and it was only gradually through the late 1930s when Moscow sent somebody to basically to challenge him. Wang Ming was his name, in 1937 in November when he arrived. It wasn't until Mao disposed of Wang Ming and Stalin bought off on that in 1942 that Mao became the unchallenged leader of the party, and he remained in that position until he died in 1976. So this resulted in a purge over the next several years of hidden counter-revolutionaries, including 80,000 intellectuals. Now at this point, purges were targeted against people in the party and against the society's elite. So this was not any sort of general terroristic sort of purge at this point. Let's go on to slide 6, and we'll talk about two key arrests during this time. The first against the longtime pro-communist writer named Hu Feng, who in this period in the 1950s was criticizing CCP-approved literature because he considered it to be out of touch. It was stuff like it was novels written by completely bought-in artists like Ding Ling, a woman writer, who wrote stuff that had stereotypical heroes who were completely clean, had no personality. It was meant to pass through the party censors and to show the 100% correct stance of the Communist Party, and very black and white. Evil and criminal enemies of the party, and pure as the driven snow, red as red heroes. Hu Feng thought that this sort of literature was ridiculous, and there was a group of writers around him who called themselves the realists. And when he was arrested Everybody around him was arrested. This wasn't more than a couple dozen people, but they were all well-known writers. And the fact that they were taken down like this all at once sent the very clear message to everyone in the artistic community that the party's ideological guidance was supreme, and you don't fool with the party. You don't fool with the, you don't ignore the propaganda department. Going on to slide 7, a different kind of key arrest happened the same year, a little bit earlier actually. This man on the right, Pan Han-yen, who's seen receiving the Panchen Lama. Pan Han-yen had, I could go on and on about him. He had an enormous, very successful, very effective, very significant career up to this point with CCP intelligence. He was a very early member of the party. He organized urban networks at the most difficult times. He managed to run dozens of agents who were running other agents all over in the Japanese areas and in the Kuomintang areas during the Revolution and during World War II, and he accomplished great things. But he made one mistake, and that was that he was told to try to recruit the intelligence chief of named Wang Shichun of Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei being the puppet leader who had been Chiang Kai-shek's rival. The puppet leader calling himself a Kuomintang member, Republic of China president under the Japanese, placed in Nanjing in a similar position to Puyi up in Manchuria, the subject of the film The Last Emperor. And Pan Han-yen went to see Wang Shichun in Shanghai in 1943, and lo and behold, into the room walks Wang Jingwei. Now, Pan Han-yen was not under instructions to see Wang Jingwei, and so when this happened, he was a little bit surprised, but he spoke, and both Wang Jingwei and Wang Shichun knew who Pan Han-yen was, chief communist spy, and they were, it was late in the war, they were beginning to realize the Japanese were going to lose, and by making this contact with Pan Han-yen, they were hedging their bets and trying to save their necks. However, Pan never reported this meeting, and eventually it would take too long to discuss it, but eventually Mao Zedong found out about this in 1955. He became rather paranoid about the whole thing, had Pan Han-yen arrested, and it took 7 years, but 7 years later he was tried for treason. And during the Cultural Revolution he was rearrested. He was sort of let out on house arrest, but during the Cultural Revolution he was rearrested and eventually died in prison. So the message there was that Mao's exercise of arbitrary power could extend anywhere he liked. And by the way, over 1,000 intelligence officers were detained, and most of them were jailed. It was a very nasty situation, and that same year, a planned reorganization occurred, and it stripped them of their best people, just as their intelligence apparatus, their foreign intelligence apparatus, was being reorganized. So it's the sort of thing that historians don't talk about very much, because the research that shows this chain of events was only recently accomplished by a scholar named David Chambers. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about what led into land reform, which I left out last week. About 1/5 of the country, that includes Tibet, if you include the whole PRC, about 1/5 of the land was already redistributed before 1949. Land reform had been carried out. And land reform was rather radical. during that period because there was a war on, and quite often a place where land reform was implemented under communist occupation would change hands and go back to the nationalists. So part of the communist program was to execute most of the landlords. They didn't always do that, but quite often they did. And so this was a very radical phase. It included something called trader weeding, which is at the bottom of that. Going on to slide 9, but that changed in the early stage of the PRC, the first stage of land reform, because the idea that Mao and the leadership had was to preserve, not screw up, agricultural production, because it was needed not only to avoid hunger in the land, but also to be the basis for industrialization and to support the cities. So the landlords were eliminated as a class, but they were not killed. Their land was taken away, it was redistributed, they were criticized, but then they were made to farm the land like everybody else. They were taken down a few notches, in other words. But then came the Korean War, and which we talked about last time, and China's involvement in it, and the fear that that China might be attacked, and so on. And this brought a more wartime atmosphere to the whole deal. And there was a lot more, we're on slide 10 now, and there was a lot more vociferous of an approach that was taken by the Communist Party to handle land reform. That picture you see on the bottom there is what it looks like. It's a landlord couple. They were trussed up, hands behind backs, feet tied together, and gently lowered into a specially designed hole. And then it was filled up, and they were left there to die. This was a very common thing that was done not only by the communists, but by other people during the Chinese Revolution, and it was also done by the communists in the time after December 1950. And how many times it was done, nobody really knows, but this was one of the things that was carried out. We'll stop here and go on to audio 2 and slide 11.